renormalizing relations with Russia, creating a new
Russia?
Creating, I would say, a better international order based on sovereign equality and respect for even the civilizational and political differences and the different values between countries.
How does that apply to Russia invading Ukraine exactly? It's simply nonsense what you're saying. It's nonsense. So don't make
in
it
2014
let me finish now. Don't make it look as if Ukraine is the threat to Putin. Putin is a savage dictator who invaded Ukraine.
Hello and welcome back to the Brussels Signal Studio. My name is Justin Stairs and we're going to have a debate for you today. We have two guests in the studio and we have provisionally entitled this debate, Should Brussels Have More Power? Power, one of my favourite subjects. Let's introduce our guests. Ladies first, Sophie Veld was one of the European Parliament's best-known politicians. I think that's fair. She comes from the Netherlands and has a 20-year career in the Parliament from 2004 to 2024, this year. She heralds from the liberal tradition, the D66 party, and later went on to join the progressive Eurofederalist Volt party. Now, I've asked her before we started if I can call her a Euro-federalist, and she said, sort of, but maybe we're going to have to define that term. What does Euro-federalism actually mean? In the blue corner, or the other corner, we have author and journalist Thomas Fazi. Thomas is an independent researcher, writer and journalist based in Rome and has come up to Brussels for our event today. He is the author of several books, including The Battle for Europe, How an Elite Hijacked a Continent and How Can We Take It Back, and also Reclaiming the State, a progressive vision of sovereignty for a post-neoliberal world. He defines himself as an anti-EU leftist. How about that? Okay, so before we start the debate, before we try and answer the question, should Brussels have more power, I wanted to just quote both of you. Sophie has written a book called Naked Power, which draws on her time in the European Parliament. And it's well worth a read. I just wanted to whet your appetite with a couple of quotes. For example, Sophie, you wrote, "The COVID-19 pandemic locked down most of society and the European Parliament could not escape the influence of the lockdown measures. Lockdown and other restrictive COVID measures massively curtailed the activity of parliaments around the world, including the European Parliament. It greatly contributed to its already diminished power and influence." Now, obviously, Pfizergate is happening now. COVID, I think maybe now, for the first time, we're starting to look back on COVID with a certain amount of distance and we can maybe start to analyse what actually happened. Anyway, another quote. You wrote a lot about digitalisation. You wrote, "Digitalisation has created fantastic new possibilities for the citizens for sharing knowledge and viewpoints. Overall, the digital revolution has placed a potent means of exerting democratic power in the hands of citizens. At the same time, however, digitalization has given authorities infinitely more power than it has citizens. The imbalance of power between the individual and the government has actually grown. Any given government has more ways to intervene in our lives than it had before. Remarkably enough, it was often parliaments that enthusiastically created new digital powers for the government. Instead of guarding the balance of power, parliaments often strengthened the executive power, here we go, power again, without at the same time strengthening democratic oversight. Now, this is one of the main themes in your book, that the European Union needs more democratic oversight. Okay, I did have one more quote from yours. From your book, "Some fear the ascendancy of the EU as a superstate. That risk is far beyond the horizon. The reverse is actually happening. The ascendancy of a Europe made up of superstates." Thomas, in your work, which you entitled The Silent Coup, you also touched on COVID. You wrote, The raft of scandals surrounding the whole vaccine procurement process highlights the complete lack of accountability of the EU system and of the European Commission in particular, and why the latter's ever-expanding political role is so problematic. Ultimately, Pfizergate, this is the scandal involving text messages reportedly sent between Madame von der Leyen, the European Commission President, and a vaccine manufacturer, isn't an isolated incident, you wrote, but a reflection of the EU's true nature, a haven where unelected politicians and corporate leaders can cozy up to each other, often away from prying eyes. That's quote number one. Let's have another. What's particularly tragic, you talk about von der Leyen again. What is particularly tragic is that von der Leyen's authoritarian top-down approach to the Ukraine crisis hasn't transformed the EU into a geopolitical actor capable of standing on its own in the world stage and standing up for its interests. On the contrary, by unquestionably deferring to US strategy, von der Leyen has made the EU more vassalized to the US. And finally, the EU suffered a much greater economic and social impact from the financial crisis than the US, where the crisis originated in large part due to the structural dysfunctionalities of the Eurosystem, which have yet to be resolved. Now, one of the main points you made in your work, The Silent Coup, is that if it's true that the EU deserves more power, that we are better off cooperating, then where are the results? Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. I mean, the narrative we've been hearing for decades now is one that we're all too familiar with. And that is that because we live in this new age of globalization, hyper-globalization, maybe not so much anymore, but that's what we've been hearing until not too long ago. National sovereignty has essentially been rendered meaningless. Individual states are powerless vis-a-vis the forces of the market and other super states around the world. And so, because national sovereignty has de facto been rendered meaningless by globalization, then we might as well, even formally renounce the sovereignty and cede it to a supranational organization. We might as well pool our sovereignties together in one collective sovereignty in the form of the European Union, and that will make us stronger, that will make us economically more powerful, politically more assertive, geopolitically more capable of acting as a regional power in the world, and we'll all be better off. And so there was always a big problem in that argument, and that is the big democratic problem that's at the heart of supranationalization, of the transfer of power from the national to the supranational level, and that's the well-known democratic deficit of the European Union. But more importantly, what we've seen is that this project hasn't even delivered on its own terms. It hasn't delivered in economic terms. It hasn't delivered in geopolitical terms. And I think this isn't despite the European Union. This isn't because the European Union is somewhat imperfect, and if we can only fix a few things, then it will deliver. I think that there's a problem with supranationalization in itself. And I think what we have now is a situation where, if we look at the economy, for example, you were mentioning how the European Union has underperformed vis-a-vis the US and other advanced economies for a very long time. And I think that has to do with the way in which the European Union, on the one hand, deprives national governments of crucial tools of economic intervention, and this is especially true for the countries of the euro area, but at the same time hasn't really transferred those powers to a European government, so to speak. And so we're stuck in this limbo where we have this very powerful non-state, which is the European Union, and I think it's and then you have, on top of the structural problems created by the euro, especially by the single currency, then you also have the political consequences of transferring all this power to these unaccountable and undemocratic institutions, first and foremost the European Commission, but not only the European Commission, of course, also the European Central Bank, which is an incredibly powerful institution. And we expect these institutions, these undemocratic institutions, to act as enlightened dictators, and I think so. We still have a democratic problem, even if they did act as enlightened dictators. But clearly, that's not the case. If we look at the decisions that the European Union took throughout the financial crisis and then throughout COVID, and now vis-a-vis Ukraine and other geopolitical crises, we see a series of blunders, just one blunder after the other. And I think that has to do with the fact that these institutions are not subject to democratic accountability. And
Sophie, your chance to respond. Has the EU delivered or underperformed, as Thomas suggests?
Well, it certainly has delivered. If you look back on the last half century or so, you cannot say that we're not all better off because we have cooperated, because there's been European integration. At the same time, is it underperforming? Yes, it's underperforming. It's underperforming economically. It's underperforming vis-a-vis Ukraine, for example, as a geopolitical actor. It's been underperforming as a political democratic entity. I mean, that's probably the only point where I agree with you. I do not believe. I mean, if you look at history, it's a bit of a mistake to think that nation states have been there since Adam and Eve and that they are homogenic and they've always been the same. That's an illusion. It was never that way. It's a fairly recent invention which was imposed very much top-down and very often with violence, suppressing local identities or invading countries. So this idealization of the nation state, I think, is a bit naive and an anachronism. What I do see, I there agree with you. The European Union, in order to become more democratic and more accountable, really has to become a supranational entity, at least in those areas where it's operating. And what we see, certainly over the last 20 years, is actually the reverse. And very often people say, yeah, but member states are keeping power, for example, a veto. It's not member states, it's government leaders. What we see is a very strong concentration of power in the European Council of Government Leaders. This is something that most citizens don't realize. The European Council of Government Leaders, the European Council, is actually not. I mean, if you look at the treaties, it explicitly says that the European Council is not a legislator and that its task is to come up with a vision for the future of the European Union. So I always say it's a think tank, basically. But it's now acting as if it's a government, but it has no elected mandate. It's not accountable. It's not meeting in public. It's deciding with unanimity. And I think the biggest problem in recent years is that the president of the European Commission, and this is very strange. I mean, if you're attached to the notion of separation of powers, it's very strange that the president of the European Commission is a member of the European Council of Government Leaders. And there we have a big problem, because the European Commission is supposed to be independent and, as it were, police the member states. In other words, enforce EU legislation. But that is not happening anymore, because we have seen over the last 20 years, and certainly under Mrs. von der Leyen, that the European Commission has cozied up more and more and more and more with the European Council. For her, for Mrs. von der Leyen, her membership of the European Council is more important than being president of the European Commission. She's keeping the European commissioners on a leash, as it were. She's indeed very top-down, very directive. And for her, the center of power is the European Council. And she's probably right. The problem is the European Council is taking decisions, but it's not accountable to anyone. Nobody can verify how decisions are taken because they're not meeting in public. And that is where the real problem lies. And you know why this development has taken place is because, with the exception of the President of France, all the other government leaders are at home. They are, as a prime minister, they are first among peers. But because they're in the European Council, they get this sort of, presidential status, and they kind of like it. And if you look, if I may, one last remark. Those people who feel that it's actually a good thing that this is happening, that government leaders are, very often they're referred to even as the European leaders. I would say neither one nor the other. if you look at the composition, a large part of them are either crooks, authoritarians, corrupted, or lame ducks. I mean, if I look at let's say the stable, reasonable, reliable government leaders, it's only a handful, and mainly of small countries. Let's say, I don't know, Luxembourg, Ireland, the Baltics, something like this. Okay, you might throw in Poland, 50-50. But that means, I mean, why do we assume that if we put these 27 people plus Ursula von der Leyen together, that they will suddenly be brilliant, wise, democratic, visionary, courageous leaders for the whole of the European Union? It's insane.
And from your work, I understand that the solution that you're proposing is more power for the European Parliament, correct?
Well, I think it's a mix. I think what we need to look at is not institution by institution. We need to look at the balance between the institutions, because for me, democracy is the core element of democracy, parliamentary democracy, is checks and balances, accountability. Of course, you need elections, but Russia has elections. It's not a democracy, at least not in my book. And the checks and balances in the European governance system have been lost, have been eroded over the years. You need a European Commission which is independent but accountable to the European Parliament, because you said unelected officials. Sorry, the European Commission needs to get a majority in the European Parliament, and this is pretty much as it is in most member states. We would never say that, I don't know, the Dutch Prime Minister is unelected. He needs to get a mandate from the Parliament. That's very normal. But that link has been broken. And I think the most revolutionary change that we can implement is already in the treaties.
Go on.
It's not being implemented, namely that the European Commission is made smaller. What we have seen in recent days even is that national governments see the European commissioners as their ambassadors, their representatives, whereas the treaties are very clear. The European Commission needs to be independent. It cannot take instructions from governments. And that is very problematic, because if the European Commission is supposed to enforce EU laws, in other words, starting infringement proceedings against national governments, how does that work if at the same time it's taking instructions from governments?
Don't the commissioners actually have to swear an oath of independence in the European Court of Justice before they start to stay there? I mean,
yeah, but you see how, yes, absolutely. But you see that none of that is worth anything anymore. If everybody is now accepting somehow this new practice that commission, I mean, there was always a bit of national, but it's never been as strong as it is today, and it is incredibly problematic, because I mean, I have the feeling you're mixing up a little bit the policies and the governance structures. You may have you may have views on economic policies, left wing, right wing. It doesn't matter. But I think what is very important is that if the policies are adopted, that they're also being applied and enforced. And now we see that over the last 20 years, and this has been studied extensively and demonstrated, that enforcement is in steep decline, and it has become a kind of political currency for Mrs. von der Leyen in particular. I mean, she's kind of saying to government leaders, okay, I'm not going to bother you with enforcement measures if in return you support me for something else. Now that is very, very problematic, much more problematic than the point, what policy decisions are we going left or are we going right? But the fact that you cannot trust the European Commission to actually enforce what has been agreed, what's in the law.
Well, there's a lot I disagree with in there. First of all, the notion that nation states, it's exactly what I was saying at the beginning of my talk. So, you're simply repeating what we've been hearing in Europe for a very long time, that nation states are obsolete. But if we widen our view,
I use the word obsolete. I don't think so.
Or something that an artificial construction amongst others, and so we could build another. Just as we build nation states, we can build a supranational state. I think that was your argument at the European level, isn't that?
Well, you said that nation states haven't always existed. That's what you said, right?
Yeah, okay. Of course, they haven't always existed, but they remain the only place in which we've been able to build democracy as we know it. They remain quite successful around the world. In fact, the number of nation states is increasing; it's not decreasing. I wonder why nowhere else in the world are nation states, are countries moving towards the kind of supranational model of governance that we have in the European Union. I wonder why we don't have more countries around the world that want to build their own unions in Latin America or in Asia.
Like the US.
I wonder why. That's a completely different history, but we can get into that. But and so what the model that we see around the world being the most adopted and successful one is the traditional model of international cooperation. No one's against international collaboration. No one's against international collaboration. No one's against internationalism. I'm a leftist, as I said, so I'm totally in favor of internationalism. But internationalism precludes the existence of nation states. Internationalism. And if we look at, for example, successful models of international cooperation today around the world, we've got, for example, we've got the BRICS, but we've also got the ASEAN in the Association of Southeast Asian States, and those are institutions that are helping those countries to collaborate on a number of economic and political issues without those countries renouncing their sovereignty, without those countries pooling their sovereignty, but maintaining their own specific, political and cultural specificities, but collaborating on issues. And that's the kind of classic model of international cooperation that, existed before we came up with this idea of supranationalism. And I think it should be pretty clear by now, after, 30 years after the Maastricht Treaty, that model does not work. Now, I understand that, federalists still dream of building this European democracy, but I think not only is that, there are structural, I think that there are structural reasons why, that hasn't emerged so far, and it won't emerge anytime soon. You mentioned the United States, a 200-year-long process. Now, I won't deny that in maybe 200 years, we can have a European federal state. We can have a situation where every single European does not identify with their own nation states, but identifies with Europe first and foremost. So I would say that we might reach a point where the cultural conditions for Europe to become an actual state come into existence. We're very, very far from that point. So attempting to do that now will inevitably result in forcing this process onto peoples and countries that do not want that. And that's exactly what's happening at the moment. I mean, I was kind of surprised with your dismissive approach to governments. I'm sorry that you don't like the political orientation of a lot of the governments in Europe today, but those are elected governments. Those governments are the closest thing that we have to democracy today in Europe. And I think, what you're saying is that you would like to have a more powerful European Union that's capable of imposing its policies on those governments, on those elected governments. You want those governments, those elected governments, the closest thing we have to representative democracy in Europe today, to have less power. And I think this betrays, the kind of anti-democratic thrust at the heart of the EU project, I think. And that's, this idea that you say you want to give more power to the European Commission, but what makes you think that the European Commission will make better choices?
I would like to hit the brake here a little bit, because you are putting a lot of words in my mouth, a lot of things which I have not said. I've not called for the abolition of member states. I'm not calling for more powers for the European Commission. I mean, you've said a lot of things that I simply haven't said. Okay, so don't put words in my mouth.
You want a more independent European Commission.
But let's have a real serious discussion here.
Absolutely. I thought you said you want a more independent European Commission.
So it's actually in the treaties.
A commission that's less susceptible to political influence by nation states.
No,
I thought that's what you said. Okay, sorry, I misunderstood.
It says read the treaties. It's worth to read. It says that the European Commission is supposed to be independent, and they're not going to take any instructions from member states or anybody else. Now, I have never said, contrary to what you suggest, that member states should be abolished.
I didn't say you said that.
But I do feel that whatever, if you're in favor of only nation states, and I would like to challenge a little bit what you said, that they've all been massively successful, because I think many of them have not been, not in the democratic sense anyway. But what I'm saying is, if you give powers to whatever institution, whether it's national or supranational or local or whatever, at the same level, you need to have accountability. You need to have checks and balances. You need to have scrutiny. And that is not happening at the moment. Why? Because those national leaders, which have been elected by their national voters in order to do national politics, they come together here and they're actually, despite all the rhetoric, they're actually quite in favor of, or are quite happy to be part of the European governments. The problem is that they're not transparent, they're not honest, they're not accountable. They cannot even be forced to resign. And you say people have been elected by their people. Yes, and I may be more in favor of a more left-wing or a more right-wing course, but always within the boundaries of parliamentary democracy. And we see a lot of countries where that is not happening anymore. I mean, need I say Orban, for example? I don't care whether he's left-wing or right-wing. He's not respecting the democratic rule of law. And for me, democracy is not the dictatorship of
as defined by Brussels,
50,
I understand.
No, not as defined by Brussels. I mean, you don't have to be pro-EU in order to be pro-democracy. And maybe that is where we differ.
I think that the whole debate about the rule of law is purely instrumental. I mean, I think they use the rule of law argument to try to impose policies on governments whose policies they don't like.
Sorry, impose. What do you mean by impose exactly? Haven't those policies all been adopted and endorsed both by the European Parliament and the national
The rule
governments?
of law argument is used often to blackmail states.
Explain this to me. All the European laws which have been passed in a democratic process which we have all agreed upon. Now, you may not like the outcome of the process, but the process is a democratic one that all member states, including Hungary, which was actually the first country to ratify the Lisbon Treaty, they've all agreed to it, including Orban. Orban, by the way, who's quite happy to take European money when it suits him.
I think we've got clear examples of the way the EU weaponizes its powers to force policies on countries. We saw it recently with, for example, vis-a-vis Hungary's position over Ukraine. We've seen huge pressure exerted on Hungary, including threats of financial blackmail that were reported by the press. Apparently, we were told the European
blackmail.
The European
I think
Commission.
It's blackmail to accept or to expect other European citizens to pay for the dictatorship of Mr. Orban.
Okay,
who is corrupted, by the way.
So you're admitting that the European Union uses financial blackmail to try to implement its diktats, including trying to force a country to get on board with a disastrous military project that the EU is pursuing in Ukraine at the moment.
If I listen to you, because you describe yourself as leftist, but basically you're on the same line as Putin and Trump.
I don't even know what that means. What's the same line? I don't know. I don't know what line.
You're echoing their rhetoric.
Are you talking about
completely.
Ukraine? We can talk about Ukraine if you want. Yes, I think that the EU's decision to involve itself in this proxy war, because it is a NATO proxy war against Russia, has proven disastrous for the Ukrainians first and foremost, but also for the economic and security prospects of the European Union. So if being pro-peace in Ukraine makes me a pro-Putin.
But now back to your
Trump,
national, because you're very much in favor of national governments.
Yeah.
Your national government is still, although I'm very abhorred the Italian government, I suppose. Yeah. Okay. Is still despite many other things I disagree with, firmly in favor of support to Ukraine.
Yeah.
So
I know I did.
How
So
do you?
What's your point?
But that's okay for you then.
What's okay? No, I'm very critical of my government. I don't understand. What do you say?
Okay, but all the things that you've just said, proxy war, blackmail, all those things, that's your national government.
I would say that Italy is participating in this proxy war, as pretty much every EU country is. I would say that, and this is not a defense of Meloni, for whom I have no political sympathy whatsoever. As I said, I'm someone who comes from the left, so she's definitely not my politician. I would say it's pretty clear that Meloni is also going along with these policies, both on the economic front as well as on the foreign policy front, because she knows that she doesn't have much of a choice. And this relates to this, profoundly anti-democratic architecture that I was mentioning earlier.
So Italy would have been better off outside
in Italy,
the
we've
EU.
had
Can't talk over each other, or we won't be recorded.
In my country, we've had several instances in which the European Union has directly intervened to interfere in the democratic affairs of my country, especially through the European Central Bank. It's well understood, for example, that the European Central Bank in 2011 effectively engineered a financial crisis, and this has been admitted even by the mainstream financial press like the Financial Times. It essentially engineered a financial crisis in order to get a government, which I also didn't like very much, that of Silvio Berlusconi, to resign. And we've seen similar cases of monetary blackmail, especially through the ECB, applied on governments that were unfavorable to the European Union. As von der Leyen said, shortly before Maloney's election, we're not that worried about the outcome of this election because we have the tools to deal with it. And it's clear to everyone what she was referring to. And I don't see how this fits a democratic framework where you can elect a government with a certain platform, with a certain program, but that government ends up really not being able to implement the program, the platform has been elected on, because it lacks all the necessary kind of economic tools that are needed to implement an economic policy. Maybe an economic policy that goes against what is the kind of EU's agenda. That to me is not democratic at all.
Well, yeah, I'm extremely critical of how the European Union functions. It is far from perfect, but I would not stray into the area where you are of conspiracy theories and seeing the EU as some sort of evil plan. And if you're in favor of Italy leaving the European Union, of course, you're completely entitled to your views. I believe that in the world of today, where we are facing Putin, who is actually, half and half threatening not to invade Europe with tanks, because he's not going to do that, but to disrupt the European Union by attacks on infrastructure, by interference in elections. He's massively interfering in elections,
as the European Union is
successfully, facing Trump, an extremist, a convicted criminal, and a rapist in the White House. I'm quite happy that we have the European Union. It makes us stronger, but we need to now make the European Union more democratic, more transparent, more accountable. And there we have a lot of work to do. And the point is, the answer is either you completely dissolve the European Union and go back to the nation states, which I think would be a disaster. And the only ones happy about that would be in the Kremlin and in the White House, the next White House.
A lot of Europeans would be happy to.
Or you make the European Union stronger as a supranational entity, but then you have to have a fully fledged supranational parliamentary democracy. And that is where there is still a gap. And we're still in this area where we cling to the illusion that a nation state can face the challenges of the world today. But even, you're talking about the European Union, but you know what is eroding?
Nation state is
what is eroding national sovereignty? Because national sovereignty, yes, it worked well for a certain period of time where the challenges presented themselves at a certain level. Now we're looking at the digital revolution, at climate change, at huge geopolitical challenges, at migration. Globalization has always been there. It's been there since the beginning of times. It's nothing new, but it's presenting itself in a different way. And if we want to not just face the challenges, but also make Europe stronger, give a boost to the European economy, because I do hope that on one thing we agree, that we are interested in the prosperity and the well-being of European citizens, then I think we need to make the European Union stronger and more democratic and not dismantle it.
Well, I'm going to ask Thomas to respond on the Ukraine question, but before I do, could you respond on his point that the European Union or the European Central Bank has intervened to create financial crises that have resulted in the downfall of prime ministers. His point was Silvio Berlusconi, for example.
But we have Greece as well. The example of
Greece is arguably another one. What do you say to that?
I happen to know Greece quite well, and no, sorry, this is really a conspiracy theory, which is absolute nonsense. You can question many of you can question many of the policies, and I think the recipe that was given in particular to Greece was wrong. It was to a large extent also steered by all sorts of prejudices and caricatures, which had very little to do with the facts on the ground. But I think we should also recognize that, the successive governments of Greece, whether they were left-wing or right-wing, were in many cases incompetent and corrupted. Because I think if you're talking about the elite, I never know exactly what that is, but the ruling classes in Greece, as soon as the financial crisis struck, they were very quick to make sure that their money left the country and it was parked somewhere safe in other countries. The Greek political parties are really, let's say that they are to a very large extent responsible for the situation that the country found itself in. The response then was not the right one. But I don't think that you can say, the Greek governments did everything well, and then there was this conspiracy by the European Central Bank aimed to bring down. Sorry, that's real nonsense.
I need to respond to that. I'm sorry, just very briefly.
Go on then quickly. I want to talk.
You said you wanted a serious debate, but if everything I say is just dismissed as a conspiracy theory, then it becomes very hard to have a serious debate. So let's get into some of the details. 2009, we know that Trichet, that then President of the European Central Bank, sends a letter, a secret letter that was then leaked to the press, to the Irish government, saying you have to bail out the banks, otherwise we will stop supporting your banking system. This was a very clear threat to the Irish government, essentially telling the Irish government that it had to bail out the banks because the Irish banks were in turn indebted to a lot of other big European banks, especially in Germany and France. You have to bail out your banks, or otherwise we will stop supporting, we will stop offering emergency liquidity support to your banks. And the next day, the government announces that it's going to bail out the Irish banks. Again, a secret letter that was only subsequently leaked. We have, the case of Greece, saying that's what's a conspiracy theory. I mean, what we witnessed in 2015 in Greece is something that I would say is almost unprecedented in a history of banking and monetary policy. A central bank deliberately shutting down the banking system of a country, because that's what happened in Greece. Essentially shut the ECB, by stopping the emergency liquidity support to Greek banks, forced the Greek banking system to shut down. And not only is that unprecedented, but even worse, that was clearly intended to force the Tsipras government to accept the new bailout and the new memorandum of agreement, which they had been elected to fight against. And that's exactly what the government in the end ended up doing. So that was clearly intended to bring the government to heel. And, we've got several other examples of the way in which the European Central Bank has directly used its power, its currency issuing powers to influence democratic elected governments. And as I said, in the case of Italy, even force a government to resign. I'm sorry that you see this just as a conspiracy theory. I mean, I'll be happy to provide you with all the information if you want to read. If you want to read a bit more about it.
I think I think the ECB. I'm very happy that the ECB is very independent. I still believe that central banks should be independent from politics. I do not. Sorry, I mean, where you are going, suggesting that the ECB or Trichet was playing politics and trying to bring down government. Sorry, that's fairly ludicrous. You may challenge in hindsight whether the recipe was the right one, but I think you're also mixing up what the ECB did in order to secure the stability of the currency, and I'm glad they did what they did, and political decisions that were taken vis-a-vis certain countries. And I think, yes, I've just said that I think the recipe imposed on Greece was not the right one, and it was steered by the wrong considerations. But I think to accuse the ECB of interfering in, having some sort of regime change agenda is fairly ludicrous.
You said that, but that's a good term.
Yeah, I want to challenge you on Ukraine, and then I'm going to open the debate up to some questions. So please think of a few questions. Javier is going to have a microphone. Now, on Ukraine, here in this studio, I've interviewed a number of MEPs who you could describe as pro-peace, pro-Ukraine. And obviously, as you know, this is a pro-Ukraine city. Now, one of the arguments, perhaps the most convincing argument that the pro-Ukraine camp makes is that if we stop supporting Ukraine in any way, Ukraine will fall, and then who's next? This is the who's next argument, and this would seem to be backed by history. How do you respond to that? I presume you put yourself in the pro-peace camp.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, I consider that argument to be ludicrous. This idea that, if we don't achieve a full military victory in Ukraine, then we're going to have the Russian armies invading Europe all the way to Lisbon. I think it's completely ludicrous. I think that Russia has neither the intention nor the means, I would add, to attack Europe or to invade Europe, and why would it do it in the first place? So no, I mean, I don't believe that scenario is a realistic one at all. I think the longer this war goes on, the more destructive it's going to be for Ukraine. I think everyone's realizing now that achieving a full military victory and retaking every inch of lost territory, which is the narrative that EU leaders have been pushing since day one, and even egging on the Ukrainian government to stick to this stance, is impossible. It's never going to happen. In fact, it never was a realistic objective. And I think by fueling this notion that a full military victory in Ukraine was possible, I think we've done a big disservice to Ukraine, especially considering that very early on in the early weeks of the invasion, we know the Ukrainian government was ready to negotiate a peace deal, which would have been that didn't involve giving up any territory. So it would have been an infinitely better peace deal than anything Ukraine can hope to achieve today. And we know that they were very deep into the negotiations. They'd gone up to the 16th draft of this peace agreement. And this is very early on. I think we're talking about March, April 2022. Until the Western governments, especially the US and UK governments, stepped in and essentially told the Zelensky government to stop negotiating. And this is on record. So you might say this is a conspiracy theory, but again, this is all on record. And I think, I think this has been disastrous. It's been disastrous for Ukraine. And of course, it's been disastrous for Europe. I mean, we know that Europe has suffered an enormous price in economic terms. Ordinary Europeans have suffered an enormous price in economic terms from decoupling from Russian gas. And, interestingly, you mentioned, Russia's threat to infrastructure. Well, the biggest attack on Europe's energy infrastructure has been the bombing of Nord Stream. And I think everyone agrees that Russia wasn't behind that. We now know that it most likely was Ukraine or with most likely support, Ukrainian rogue operatives. But with most certainly the green light of the US government, and again, this has been reported by the Wall Street Journal. I'm not making this up. Speaking of attacks and threats to infrastructure, so I think I think it's been absolutely, the whole strategy over Ukraine has been disastrous, and I think it points to what I was saying earlier. It's been only has been bad for Ukraine. It's been very bad for us, and I think it points to the fact that. You said the European Union is making us stronger. You're happy that we have the European Union because of what's happening in Ukraine. But what has the European Union's policy over Ukraine got us? Where has it got us? It's got us to a point where Europe is suffering a devastating economic crisis. Entire countries are deindustrializing, and that is to a large degree a direct result of the Ukraine policy, of the energy policies.
Well, I'm very interested to hear you first make a very strong argument in favor of national sovereignty, and then basically hear you argue that Ukraine should capitulate. Because let's talk words here. When you say pro-peace, I think the most pro-peace people on this planet are the Ukrainians themselves, because they're the ones who are suffering from the attack and the invasion. So they want peace. But do you want peace and retain, on reasonable terms, retaining your territory, or do you want to capitulate? It's not the same. And many people like you, others who are also echoing what the Kremlin is saying, are arguing in favor of capitulation, just accepting the fact that whatever the Russians have occupied so far, and since 2014, not since 2022, that the Russians can keep that. So what is then going to stop Putin from going further and further? And you say, oh, it's ridiculous to assume that he's going to go further. Every time he announces that he's going to go further, we don't seem to believe him, and yet he does what he says that what he promises, and he believes in restoring the old Russian Empire or even the Soviet Empire or whatever. He feels that the Baltics. He says Ukraine has no right to exist. He feels the Baltics should return to the Russian Empire. I mean, and he is interfering. He is attacked. He has years ago already. He has completely paralyzed Estonia with a cyber attack for I think almost a week or something. He does what he is saying. Now, I still believe, if you believe in national sovereignty, then you would probably agree with me that Russia has no business invading, aggressing another country and denying it its existence. Okay, so. I think where Europe has indeed failed is to give full and rapid support to the Ukrainians in order to defend themselves. Because you're talking about military victory. What do you mean, military victory? Military victory would only mean that they can to defend their own people, their own country, that they can live in safety and know for sure that Putin is going to go back to behind the borders and respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And the point is that Ukraine has been betrayed many times because they were asked to give up their own capabilities, and then in return, its territorial integrity and sovereignty was going to be respected. And that didn't happen. And Europe didn't respond in 2014, and it responded only very slowly and hesitantly in 2022. I think they are fighting. The Ukrainians are on the battlefield fighting for the values that we have been discussing here. And I think they deserve our full support. Ukraine has not invaded Russia. Russia has invaded Ukraine.
Okay, let's stop. Let's have a question.
Okay, if I can start with.
We're turning on the mic.
Yep. Now
Is that Peter? Were you looking to ask a question?
no. The question is about the reform of the treaties, according to how they are planned. Brussels is planning to absorb competences in defense, public health, security, foreign affairs. What do you think about that?
Right, so this is treaty change. For those who don't know, there's a new push now to reform the treaties, and one of the results of this reform would be the abolition of certain vetoes, for example, nation-state vetoes in areas such as foreign policy. What do you think?
Well, I'm in principle in favor of treaty change, but I don't think it's the most pressing issue right now. But if we see that in response to external challenges, the European Union is becoming active in more policy areas, okay, that's fine with me. You can abolish vetoes in many other ways. You don't necessarily need treaty change. But wherever the vetoes are abolished, or wherever the European Union takes up new responsibilities, new tasks, we need to have scrutiny and accountability at an equal level. And that is where I'm concerned, because I see that in the last years under Ursula von der Leyen, and although I am appreciative of some of the stuff that she's done, but I'm very critical about her lack of understanding of democracy and accountability. That is what we have to fix. And we're not going to fix it only with treaty change. I think the current treaties offer us sufficient means to fix those problems. What we lack is the political will.
Treaty change.
Well, first of all, let me say that the European Commission has already hugely expanded its powers in all those areas. And it's done that surreptitiously. That's what my report, The Silent Coup, is all about. I don't know what you're laughing about, because it's pretty clear that the European Commission has expanded its powers throughout the COVID crisis. It expanded its powers in terms of health policies. I think that's before everyone's eyes. It used that crisis, for example, to push for the issuance of EU common debt. Which is something that countries have strongly been opposed against for a long time. It used that crisis to surreptitiously push for something that several member states have long been opposed to. We've clearly seen the European Commission use the Ukraine crisis to essentially acquire a central role in the foreign and even military and security policy of the European Union, essentially driving the sanctions policies. And again, you talk of the power of the European Council, but the sanctions policies and even similar situations during the COVID crisis are clear examples of what a European Commission single-handedly took things into their own hands. You're free to read. You're free to read my report. I would say it's factually quite based, in fact. And the European Commission, especially in the first months following the invasion, was essentially driving the sanctions policies, and the member states were simply going along with whatever the European Commission said. And that largely has to do with the fact that, of course, as you said, there was an external crisis which had to be responded to rapidly. And of course, who's going to do it? Which is the only institution that can rapidly respond to a crisis? That's the European Commission. And that's why at every crisis, we see the European Commission broadly expand its powers more and more. And we've seen, even though the European Commission has formally no jurisdiction, especially over military and security affairs, we've seen von der Leyen, repeatedly, systematically speak as the commander-in-chief of de facto of the European Union.
I'd like you to answer that.
That's very problematic.
Because obviously, we have this peace facility, which is technically speaking not part of the European Union, is it? It's sort of like a legal structure that's been stuck onto, but is managed by the European Commission all the same. That's financial. And what about Thomas's point that Madame von der Leyen is talking as if she heads some kind of EU defence force without an army? I know, but there was, for example, a call between von der Leyen and the South Korean president about a new defence pact, despite the fact that this is not an EU competence. How do you respond to that one?
Well, she's been very open and clear about it. You may agree or disagree with it. I happen to agree with her because, for the last 30 years, I've had that view, but you don't have to agree with it. But to suggest that something secret happened here surreptitiously, you said that's nonsense. There's been a very public debate, which I think is good. And then you may disagree with the outcome. But to also suggest that those poor, weak government leaders, could only accept what Mrs. von der Leyen is complete and utter nonsense. They are calling the shots. The European Council is more powerful than ever. As to the sanctions, they have been adopted by the Council. There have been, 14 packages, I believe, by now. They're extensively discussed, and many member states don't apply them. But they've been discussed. There have been negotiations. There have been exceptions for certain countries. There have been Orban trying to block. So to say that was sort of surreptitiously, that's complete and utter nonsense. And you may disagree with it. You may not like the sanctions against Russia, but they were adopted by all the governments. So now I do feel that if we are, like you mentioned the European Peace Facility, there I have a problem. Also with the RRF, the resilience, what is it called? The Recovery and Resilient Fund post-COVID. I think all those financial instruments should be all put in the European budget and then subject to scrutiny by the European Parliament in public.
Which doesn't happen with the peace facility.
No, and the point with the peace facility is also who is actually verifying the accounts, if you want. Who's scrutinizing?
Where's the money going?
It's actually a kind of committee which is made up of the same member states who are actually receiving the money, and we are seeing that things, these wonderful national governments, what they're doing is, they say, okay, we have sent equipment or weapons or whatever to Ukraine, and then they have their receipt, and they go to the Commission and say, we have an expenses claim. Can you please reimburse us? But what they very often do is they send equipment which had been lying around in a shed anyway, or which was dysfunctional or whatever. So then they get their reimbursement, so they have money to buy new equipment for themselves. And the point is that it's very, very difficult to scrutinize that, because it's a bit outside the scope of the European Parliament. Now, here I also have to issue a critical note of the European Parliament. I think the European Parliament has been far too meek, not using any of the powers it has. Those powers are imperfect. They're not complete. But Parliament could have done and should have done much more to scrutinize this kind of new facilities and new instruments, and it doesn't.
Let's have another question, please.
I can go next.
Yeah.
Leaving aside the moral and ethical concerns, it seems like the European Union is now really struggling to put forward its own foreign policy and domestic policy interests, like on Ukraine, regardless of how you think of the war. With Trump now in power, it seems most people don't think that Europe can actually properly support the war in Ukraine. On climate issues, regardless of what you think of them, it seems like Europe is being outflanked on one side by China and on the other side by the United States with Biden's IRA. Even on tech regulation, like you're hearing, murmurs here from industry insiders, MEPs, about how enforceable the DSA and DMA will be for
DSA, Digital Services Act.
Digital Markets Act will be on, major players like Elon Musk, obviously, now that he's going to be very close to the US government, but also, Apple, because Trump says he was talking to Tim Cook about this recent multi-billion euro fine that was put on Apple for its dealings in Ireland. How would giving more power to the European Union help solve these issues? How could you convince voters that this is a good idea, considering the EU has seemed to have failed on a lot of these issues up until now? And conversely, how would ripping up some or part of the European Union as an institution help to rectify these issues on the other side?
Well, we haven't mentioned Donald Trump yet. In fact, let you go first.
Well, I mean, again, it's all this, the EU's failure on all those fronts is before everyone's eyes. And I think it's important to understand that there's a structural reason for this. It's natural that if you try to put, almost 30 governments together, which are culturally, politically, linguistically heterogeneous, very heterogeneous, which even have very different kind of internal domestic economic models, not to mention nowadays different, if not contrasting, geopolitical interests, or at least views, it's no surprise that you can't get them to agree on, to find a common position on a number of those issues. This is a structural problem which can't be overcome. One way of overcoming it is, yes, let's just give more and more power to the European Union. That way, we'll have more and more power to harmonize policies across the board, regardless of what different positions national governments may have. I think that can only result in bad outcomes, because this will make the European Union even more anti-democratic. We've been seeing the European Union has been becoming more powerful over the years. The European Union is clearly more powerful today than it was, 20 years ago. The European Commission clearly has more competences today, whether formally or de facto, than it had 20 years ago. It's very hard to make the case that this has improved, that this has made the European Union perform better economically, politically, geopolitically, not to mention democratically. In fact, in all those areas, I would say that things have gotten worse. And so this is, I can simply only come back to my argument of, supranationalization, further supranationalizing the European Union is not the response to the problems created by supranationalization itself. There's a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the European Union project that I think cannot be fundamentally resolved. It cannot be fundamentally reformed. Yes, you could, centralize even more power within the hands of the European Commission. Many would say that, yes, that would be okay so long as that is accompanied by greater oversight by the European Parliament, which is what you're saying. I think I understand the argument, but I also think I think it's a pipe dream. I don't think that giving the European Parliament more powers of oversight or more, legislative powers or whatever would make it fundamentally more democratic. I think there's that relates. The European Parliament will always be geographically, psychologically, I would say spiritually detached from most people in Europe. So simply voting every X years for the European Parliament, even a European Parliament that has more powers, I don't think would make the European Union substantively more democratic. And so I think, this is an unresolvable quandary. I think problems created by the European Union cannot be resolved within the framework of the European Union. That's what I believe.
I guess you don't believe that, but please explain.
Well, I'm going to respond to your question, but first you said this is an unachievable pipe dream. The funny thing is, if you go back to, let's say, the first period after the Second World War, I think what we are having today would seem like an unachievable pipe dream to the people back then. If you look at the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think freedom and democracy looked like an unachievable pipe dream to the people back then. I was sitting in the European Parliament. I was in 2004 sitting next to Bronislaw Geremek, who was then elected as in the first batch of Polish MEPs, and before that he was one of the founding fathers of Solidarność, the resistance movement against the communist dictatorship. And I was always very struck, very moved by the fact that somebody who had actually been fighting for democracy, he'd been in a camp because of his fight for democracy, and now we were together in the parliamentary benches. I always thought that was very. So I think we should be dreaming more, not less. But then back to the question, you say more powers. Who says more powers? It's not about more powers. The point is actually that we should apply the existing treaties. The problem is that the de facto power, as you say, is now lying with the European Council, which is actually the model that you like, intergovernmental cooperation and not more than that. The point is, it does not work. It does not work. If you have 27 or 28 or 30, it doesn't even matter. Even with 6, if every country has a veto, and they have to decide on things like assistance to Ukraine or all sorts of other issues, it's just not going to work. And this is the reason. It's not because of some evil, evil EU civil servants coming in on a Monday morning thinking, "Oh, how are we going to grab power today? How are we going to, to overrule the national government?" It's not like that. Every time that new powers were given, either by treaty change or de facto to EU institutions, to a supranational Europe, was always very reluctantly by the national governments. The national governments' power wasn't sort of surreptitiously wrestled from their hands. They consciously gave powers to supranational Europe. And so it's always in response to external challenges. The problem is that over the last 20 years, and if you're asking yourself, why have certain things stalled or failed, it's precisely because intergovernmental Europe is back with a vengeance. Because government leaders, not governments, not member states, not people, not citizens. No, government leaders have grabbed powers surreptitiously because most citizens don't know about this. It's their coup. If you're talking about a silent coup, it's in the European Council of Government Leaders, and they're not telling their citizens. And Mrs. von der Leyen, you may disagree with her, but at least she makes open statements about where she wants to go. The government leaders hide this fact from their citizens. Now that is surreptitious. So I'm not in favor of more powers or new powers. I'm in favor of bringing the power back where it was supposed to be, namely out in the open, in an open democratic process between the Council, not the European Council, the Commission and the European Parliament, and away from the European Council, away from the black box, back out into the open.
I want to take another question. Carl.
Yes, actually, I would like to follow up on that, because every time there is a referendum on Europe, or every time there is an election with a high turnout, like the last one, we see the Eurosceptics, when we see the people who don't love Europe vote against everything coming from Europe after there's a very big debate on it. So how do you respond to that?
Well, so this is the rise of Euroscepticism.
Yeah.
How would you explain it?
Interesting. First of all, they still are far from the majority. Far. Secondly, they're not so Eurosceptic anymore. It's very interesting. Many of the parties, even people like Marine Le Pen, for example, who's been arguing for a Frexit for a very long time, they've backtracked. So, and they're now they have this new narrative saying that they're going to break up or change Europe from the inside. Well, they're most welcome. That is the democratic process. But the vast majority are still very much in favor of the European Union. And actually, now you see EPP flirting a little bit with the far right because it's not just Eurosceptic. It's not just Eurosceptic. They're very often anti-democratic, they're far right, they're anti-international law, they're anti-human rights. They pretend to talk in favor of the people, but look at people like Trump. He's not even in the European Union, but they're all part of the international cooperation, if you want, like-minded parties. It's not that they're against the European Union, they're against democracy. So I am not afraid. I think, and you were saying you were dismissing a little bit European elections now. 200 million people went to the ballot stations. I think that's quite impressive, actually. I've been a member of parliament for 20 years. I have actually presented myself to the voters. Have you? Do you know how people think? Have you had the courage to present yourself and make your case? Because I would warmly invite you to do so. If you think that you can convince people, fine, that's democracy. But I have won elections several times, so I think
if I wanted to be involved in politics, I think I'd run at the national level, not for the European Parliament.
Well, still,
because that's where democracy is located.
The question was on the rise of Euroscepticism.
I think that's inevitable. I think people understandably view the European Union as this increasingly, unaccountable, anti-democratic, leviathan, which does infringe on national democracies. I think people are not stupid. I mean, they see that in my country is a good example. I mean, I think Italians are very aware of the fact that, why do fewer and fewer Italians go to vote? Because they realize that whoever they vote for, the outcome is always the same. And why is that? And that's because governments cannot stray from the path that's set down from Brussels and Frankfurt. I'm sorry, there's nothing funny about about that. There's nothing funny about that. I think.
Are you in favor of? Would you be in favor of Italy or any other country leaving the EU?
I think ideally I would like to see all countries get together and sit down around the table and realize that a coordinated breakup, especially of the single currency. I mean, because we've been talking about the European Union in general and the institutional architecture, but we've been talking very little about the single currency itself, which is a problem within the problem. So we can discuss about how democratic or non-democratic the European Union is, but I think when it comes to the single currency, the profound defects of the single currency are very, very evident, and none of those problems, which became apparent during the financial crisis, have fundamentally been solved. And so I think in a country like Italy, it's apparent that this is a profoundly non-democratic structure. And I think that's why they, in my country as in other countries, Eurosceptic parties are on the rise because at the end of the day, people want to have a say over the collective life of their countries. They want to have a say over the direction that their countries can go in. And I think a lot of voters, correctly feel that that's no longer the case, and that the European Union is, one of the major reasons why that's no longer the case. Whoever you vote for, you still end up, with von der Leyen essentially handing down, the policies that your country has to follow. I'm sorry that you laugh, but I mean I think that's how a lot of people feel, and I think they're fundamentally right to feel that way. I would ideally, I would like to see a coordinated breakup of at least of the single currency, but of course we know that's not going to happen. So do I think that in the medium term, a country like Italy or other countries would be better off without the euro? Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes.
Isn't it also a little bit cheap to make that argument, because you are, you're stirring up these feelings when you're saying that Italy is never going to leave the union, it's never going to leave the currency. So isn't it then a bit
There was a plan.
I never said Italy is never going to leave. I never said that.
There was a plan at one point. It wasn't a plan to leave the euro. There was.
No, I mean there was. It never was. It never was a serious. It never was a serious option because, of course, I mean, no one's saying it's easy. And you mentioned all the Eurosceptic parties have now given up on their sort of more radical anti-euro platform. You might see that as a good thing. I see that as a problematic thing. I see that as a fact of that even the so-called radical parties are restricting the scope of what they believe to be politically possible.
Okay,
within
but
the European
if you
Union.
say, let me ask you a question.
As a fact of life.
Let me ask you a question. You say that people, suggesting that this is the vast majority of people, if not all, are sick and tired of all this, and they're sick and tired of the straitjacket of the European Union. So why didn't the vast majority of Italian citizens, for example, vote to leave the single currency? They could have done so.
When did they get asked to vote when did they get? We never had a referendum on leaving a single currency, as no country has.
There wasn't any political party.
Most countries didn't even have a referendum to get into.
There wasn't any political party making that proposition. So apparently, there wasn't a single political party who thought that there was an electorate for that issue.
That's absolutely not true. In 2018, who won the elections in 2018 with a very strong majority? Two parties, the League and the Five Star Movement, which back then had very, very strong positions on the EU and on the euro. Both the Five Star Movement and the League were proposing referenda to exit the euro up until 6 months before the election. And everyone knows that their strongly euro-critical and EU-critical stance is probably the main reason why people voted for those parties in 2018. So that's absolutely not true.
Why didn't they follow through?
Because the parties themselves have never had any intention of following through on that. That's a complete different argument. We're talking about, you said, how do people feel about it, and that's how they feel about it. They felt, that they wanted to give their vote to two parties who both, more or less openly advocated for Italy leaving the euro and leaving.
So why don't you argue for a referendum then? And leave the single currency, leave the union.
That's a completely different argument. Who's supposed to?
Well, you're a citizen.
I can't.
You're a citizen. And if you say that none of the political parties is actually taking up the issue,
completely different. No one's saying that it's easy. Of course, you've created this institutional Frankenstein, and no one is saying that it's easy to dismantle it or to leave it. That doesn't mean that it. That it works.
So it's better to just say to complain and not take any action.
I don't even know what that means. We've been talking about possible ways of reforming this system for a very long time, and I don't see. I don't see that.
You think that Italy should leave?
I think Italy would be better off out. Yes.
Okay, so why don't you take action if you feel strongly about it?
I don't even know what that means. I mean, it's not. I'm a journalist. I'm a researcher, and in my work, I make my position very clear. I've made it for years.
I'm looking to see if there are any other questions. Anne-Laure, did you have a question? Sophia? Otherwise, we're going to move towards the end with a question of my own, and it's a very difficult question because I'm going to ask you to try and
extra points.
trying to ask you to try and predict the future. Okay, impossible question, in fact, but let's have a go. Where do you think the European Union will be in 5 or 10 years' time?
Oh, it's an impossible question. I've been working in Europe in one way or another for 30 years, and I've learned one thing. It is impossible to make any predictions, in particular about the future. So we like to joke, but because things always happen. They're events, as they say, and sometimes things which seem very obvious never materialize, and other things that you never thought were possible happen. So I'm not going to make any.
But what about? But obviously, the history of the European Union has been towards more power. To go back to where we started, should Brussels have more power? Then the history of the European Union has been in that direction. Okay, we're imperfectly according to your thesis. Do you think this will continue?
Let me put it this way. I'm an optimist by nature, but I'm a very worried optimist at the moment, because if the first term of Donald Trump wasn't enough of a wake-up call, if the war in Ukraine wasn't enough of a wake-up call, if a second term of Trump isn't enough of a wake-up call, then what is? And I think there is general consensus. I mean, here I have a different analysis than you have. I do think that there is a general consensus among citizens that they want a strong Europe to defend to protect and defend them and create prosperity. But I think that the current institutional setup of the European Union is too weak. This intergovernmentalism leads to paralysis. It leads to lack of accountability, transparency, lack of progress, lack of determination and decision making, and I think that is potentially very, very dangerous, because I do not believe, contrary to you, that the national states are better off on their own in the world of today.
Same question.
Well, I think the European Union is once again at a crossroads. I think if it continues going down the path that it's been going down these past few years, and that is embracing this kind of new Cold War style approach to international relations, where it's completely aligned itself with America's increasingly desperate attempts to put down every potential threat to U.S. Western hegemony, whether coming from Russia, whether coming from China, or from anyone else. I think it's destined to implode, and that's not something that I applaud as much as I would see the EU to fall, because I think it will happen at the end of a very of an increasingly disastrous social and economic process of disintegration, and that's not something I wish on anyone. I think potentially Europe can embrace a different approach. I mean, we live in a completely different world today. It's a multipolar world, and Europe, I think, could thrive by engaging with the new non-Western bloc that's emerging, with the BRICS, and that of course includes renormalizing relations with Russia, creating a new
Putin's Russia.
Yes, of course. I'm sorry, you don't choose foreign leaders. I'm sorry, I'm sure you're happy to buy oil from countries in the Middle East, or you're probably against that too. But so yes, that includes renormalizing relations with Russia, and I think we have to give up this kind of Western exceptionalist supremacist worldview where we see it as our duty to export our values to the rest of the world. Clearly, we're witnessing a situation where the global majority is rejecting this approach by the West and is trying to build, I would say, a different international order. I would say a better international order based on sovereign equality and respect for even the civilizational and political differences and the different values between countries.
How does that apply to Russia invading Ukraine exactly?
That applies to us arming Ukraine and with the aim
to defend itself,
with the aim of threatening Russia. I think that's with the aim of destabilizing Russia. I think what are you laughing at? I think it's I think any country would consider a foreign hostile military bloc. There
was no
positioning.
Sorry,
arming a country with whom you share a border. Every country would see that as a threat. I think if Russia started to massively arm Canada or Mexico, the United States would see that as a threat. So, but
nonsense. What you're saying, it's nonsense.
It's history.
There was an invasion. First of all, Ukraine was made up to give up its nuclear capabilities in order to have its territorial integrity respected. It wasn't respected in 2014. We didn't send weapons. It wasn't respected in 2022, and we very reluctantly and slowly sent military support. So don't make it
in 2014 when the
Let me finish now. Don't make it look as if Ukraine is the threat to Putin. Putin is a savage dictator who invaded Ukraine and who is also threatening EU member states. That is the reality. So don't
Ukraine is clearly the victim.
It is the victim. Ukraine is the victim.
Of course,
and
Ukraine
Putin
is the victim.
Is the dictator.
Is the victim.
And you are echoing his narrative.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. I know you always. I know that's you can resort to easy accusations, conspiracy theory.
It's a fact. You're actually echoing his narrative.
Okay. I'm sorry that my analysis, on some elements tends to converge with someone who you don't like. I'm really sorry about that. But yes, of course, Ukraine is the victim. Ukraine was initially the victim of Western meddling beginning in 2014 when the West helped overthrow a democratically elected government in Ukraine, kickstarting the chain of events that brought us to where we are today. So Ukraine is definitely the victim, but it's also the victim of the West.
Ukraine, that's the fact.
Yes.
Russia invaded
9 years
Ukraine,
after we toppled a democratically elected government.
Ding, ding, ding. End of the round. That was a great feisty debate. Many thanks, Sophie, for coming in today. And thank you, Thomas, for coming all the way from Rome to be with us. Thank you for the questions here from the public. And thank you very much for watching. We'll do more of these debates. See you next time.